Hi, everyone. We're going to give people just a couple minutes to log in and get settled here before we start. All right, well, we can dive in and people can jump in and join as we go. But first of all, welcome to everyone who has joined us. Certainly welcome to Susan McPherson, who we have featured today. Before we jump in, I do want to highlight, sorry, Kathy, can you just go back one slide? I do want to highlight our new branding that we have that's just being released in the market. And this is the first actual event we have featuring it. So our new name, Marketing Club of New York, and a first look at our new logo. So pointing that out for all of our members who have been around through all the changes. So before we dive in, certainly thank you to our sponsors, Wyland, Alliant, Starista, Adstra, Claritas, bronze sponsors Epsilon, Summer Friday, Complete Mailing Systems, and of course, Vicker, Botham. So thank you to everyone who makes all of these events possible. Really quick, highlighting some upcoming events. We have some big ones on the calendar that we're really excited about. Our Data Privacy Summit in New York on September 14th. Comedy and cocktails, time and location is TBD, but we'll be sharing more information on that. And then, of course, our Silver Apples Gala, which is going to be November 10th this year. So save the date for those. There's a lot of other events coming up as well, but these are some of the bigger ones that we want to make sure everyone is aware of. Okay, so webinar guidelines. This is really set up as a QA session. So questions from all of you are very important, although certainly I've prepared a couple to get us started. You guys will remain on mute. So please enter all questions in the box and I will bring them up. With that, if there's any technical difficulties, you can enter that in the chat box as well. And once we get through a couple of our questions to get it set up, we will start to tap into the audience questions. So feel free to fill the chat box with those. All right, I'm going to moderate the session today. And today we're really focused on learning the lost art of connecting. It's interesting, I know we're all kind of painfully aware how the last few years have shifted the marketplace, have shifted how we do business, some of that good, some of that bad. But we really wanted today to kind of take a step back from keeping up with emails and keeping up with everything going on in our crazy schedules, and really talk about, what we've lost in communication. What are some of the different perspectives that we have now on how we connect with people? How has that changed? And how can we dissect some of the ways that we can really go back to or improve our communications and the relationships that we've developed, especially in this virtual world. So I'm going to introduce Susan McPherson here. She's amazing. She's had a ton of great presentations. We found her through a conference that she did a little while ago. So we're really excited to have her. She's the CEO and founder of McPherson Strategies. It's a boutique communications consultancy. And more recently, she's the author of the book, The Lost Art of Connecting, the Gather, Ask, Do method for building meaningful relationships. So I would encourage you all to go buy her book. You can find it on Amazon. She'll give you some more information if you want it, but she's really inspirational and has a lot of great information for us today. She's also a frequent speaker at national trade conferences, media programs. Again, that's how we found her. And she's been featured in publications such as NPR, CNN, USA Today, and that's just a few, because I don't want to bore you with a long list.
Yeah, please.
So Susan, welcome. Thank you so much for joining us. Can you go ahead and give us a little background on what you've been working on most recently, and of course, your company and your book?
Yes. Thank you, Alicia, and thank you to your amazing organization. And yes, I met Ken at a company called MX at a conference back in February, when we were first starting to kind of weed our way back into kind of real life events. And I was definitely nervous to get on stage when I had done hundreds of these, but via, with the screen in between. I remember getting up on the stage and the first thing I said is, wait, where's the screen? But yes, I run a strategy consulting firm that is focused on impact communications. I founded it about 9 years ago. But about 4 or 5 years ago, a lot of people kept saying to me, Susan, you're an ultimate connector. Why don't you write a book on it? And I remember thinking, first of all, nobody needs to hear 225 pages of me. But when I started to look at the numbers behind our firm, I realized there was something there to connections. I mean, they're well and good, but there's money to be made. And I don't mean to be that crass, because I run an impact firm, but I want people to make money. There's nothing wrong with that, because then they can do good with that money. But I realized that over the years of the firm, we were about 92% inbound, meaning we never did any advertising, very little marketing. And it was really from those connections I built in my 20s, in my 30s, in a good chunk of my 40s, because I founded the company at age 48. I'm now 57. And so I realized there's a powerful message to share, so that people don't think it's all about just for the fun of it. I also, again, a lot of people see the title, and here, I'll get the book. Right here, The Lost Art of Connecting, and they assume that it was written in response to the pandemic. But what I had started to notice, maybe as early as 2017, was that we were losing our intentionality when it came to connecting, meaning it was so easy to zap off a text or a DM on a social media platform that we had lost that kind of like meaning behind it. It had just gotten too easy. Now, mind you, I am pro-technology. I am not a Luddite. I take advantage, maybe except for TikTok. I'm on all the platforms because I look at them as means of connection, of building more meaningful connections. But I also knew I was an outlier, because I was using these platforms often as early as 2007 to showcase others, to shine others, and build connections that way. And then in 2017 or 2018, a friend of mine told me that when she took her son and daughter to the school bus stop in the morning, she would hug them goodbye and send them up on their merry way. And as soon as they took their respective seats, their heads would bob down, because she'd be watching from the street, and she'd see that they would be looking at their handhelds. The scary thing was every other child on the school bus was doing the same thing. And not that I have these incredibly warm and fuzzy memories of my school bus days, but I actually talked to my classmates. And if this is the population we're growing, we need to kind of step back and see how we can be building meaningful connections. Now, when I started writing the book, it was February of 2020. And of course, March, everything changed. But over 8 months writing it, I was interviewing various leaders who had made the building of meaningful connections a core part of their success factor. Adam Grant, Whitney Johnson, Brooke Baldwin. These were people that, very creatively shared with me, how connections have been so important to them. So through the pandemic, it gave me hope that when we eventually came out of it, because remember, none of us knew that it was going to go on for 2 years, but that we were going to no longer take advantage of our precious time together. So if there are some silver linings, that certainly is one of them. I think going ahead, looking at how we build connections, we are more mindful about it. We are more caring, and we hopefully listen more, which is also something I discovered in the book is very challenging for us, especially as we communicate with others. So that's a bit of background. The book came out in April of a year ago, and I've been blessed and cursed. It's never fun to launch a book during a global pandemic for all the reasons, but on the same token, because of the subject matter, it had a longer shelf life, and probably why I'm here talking to you a year later.
Very cool. Well, that's a great overview. I would love to, your book came out a year ago. As you mentioned, when you were originally writing it and having some of those conversations, nobody anticipated the pandemic would still be going on at, 2 years later, and we would still have people not going back to the office. Can you speak a little to what you've seen since you released the book, and how I know you spoke a little bit about kind of appreciating the time that we have to connect and all of that, but what have you really seen shift over the last year?
Well, definitely people are nervous, right? They haven't been out in public in a long time. And, you have a large swath of the population that is introverted and shy to begin with. Then you layer on 2 years of isolation, and that's not a recipe for like, yay, we're back. Also, there's been these fits and starts, right? Where all of a sudden we're like, we're out, and then no, we're not, and then we're out again, and then, so I think it's been really hard to kind of really plan how but I liken it to riding a bike. Every year around April or May, I get my bike out of storage and I ride down the street in Brooklyn, and I'm convinced I'm going to die. And then by the 4th or 5th block, I'm like, oh, I got this. So I do think, we have to give ourselves some grace, but I think also, we can't stay inside forever. And when it is safe to do so, or you're comfortable to do so, do it in little bits. You don't have to immediately go to the largest event. And in the book, I talk about all little tips and tricks you can use. But, your question in terms of what I'm seeing people have a real enthusiasm and thirst. They're just nervous. And whether it's my book or, other tools, there's plenty out there that can help. But I also think we have this equalizing factor that we've all been through this. Obviously, some people suffered immense horrors from this pandemic. And for others, it was a major, major inconvenience, and painful one at that. But we all share something. We've all experienced it. And very few things in life are that equal. I mean, in terms of, I liken it as the commonality among the uncommonality. No matter who you talk to, you have a pandemic story.
Mm-hmm. Interesting.
So that can help you get over, like when you walk in a room, if you're nervous, well, guess what? Everyone else is nervous.
Right. So it's interesting that you started off with the story about the kids on the school bus, because I know as a parent, everybody has that fear that their kid is so focused on their devices that they're not paying attention. Do you see in the corporate environment or even relationships holistically any huge differences between generations or roles or functionality, anything like that?
In terms of building connections, you mean? Or, well, I think, we have a digital only teen, younger, like, I don't know what, I'm forgetting what the name of like tweens is, or teens. I mean, they have grown up with iPads in their hands. Again, that's a wild generalization, but I think you understand. And then we have Gen Z, and then but there's a real misnomer. A lot of people think that it's only the elderly that are lonely, and we have an epidemic of loneliness among all populations. So I don't think it necessarily matters on the age in terms of how. I think I do think with our younger folks, we are going to have a challenge just because they haven't, especially because of the pandemic, they haven't been out and about. So it just means that much more care and feeding to get folks feeling comfortable. And also understanding the benefits, right? I mean, you can't expect behavior change if there isn't an outcome that's going to be positive.
Mm-hmm. Very nice. Now, do you think there's any areas that we've improved our communication since the pandemic? Or do you think everything was kind of a big step back?
Oh, yeah. I mean, look at what we're doing right now, right? I mean, this is much as it's not optimum and being in person is better, it sure beats a conference call, right? Mm-hmm. And, we hopefully have improved, like knowing how to turn our volume up and, but I think it's also in some ways, for people who can't travel all the time, it's an alternative. So, I mean, these are not necessarily negatives. If our carbon footprint is going down because we're able to host have more meetings like this, that's a positive, but it can't be a crutch, right? We can't do this forever in lieu of. And I think we're seeing this at companies, this notion of hybrid, where there's going to be, we come together for various reasons, but then we go on our separate ways. And I think that might actually work better for the vast majority of those people who used to be at desk jobs. Mm-hmm. Obviously, people who have more, manual labor and such, that doesn't affect.
Yeah. So you have the book, you also have your own company. When you're talking to your employees, you know, I know you have clients at the company, and when you're coaching them on how to interact and engage with clients, what are some of your go-to tips for them for building
Oh.
relationships and connections in this virtual world?
Well, for the last 2 years, and none of us got to see each other, and we have 15 people, and we also, I should back up, my company was virtual from the get-go. So the good news is when March 2020 happened, I didn't have to all of a sudden, get rid of space and start us all over. We were very comfortable working this way. We didn't use Zoom as much. We used phone, and then we would get together in person on occasion. But, I have people stretching from Washington State to an employee in Ethiopia. Her husband works for the UN, and she moved there. So we already, but it was frustrating after a year and a half of not being able to meet. So we had our first retreat just a few weeks ago in the Western Catskills, and everyone flew in, and I was so nervous. I remember thinking, oh my God, are they going to like each other? And, one of the rules of the theme was nourishment and rejuvenation. We didn't have any kind of classes. It was more about team building. We did water aerobics, we did yoga, we had hikes, we did mood boards, and, drank wine and ate good food. But one of the underlying kind of notions is anything but the weather. Because when we talk about the weather, we don't talk about anything. I mean, granted, we are living in a time of climate where it does make sense. But if you now think about this on your next conference call, almost all of them start with, what's the weather in Cleveland, or and in the end, you don't gain anything. You don't learn anything. I don't learn anything more about you, Alicia, if I'm talking to you about what the weather is in Terrytown.
Mm-hmm.
Right? I just learned what the weather is in Terrytown, which is great, but that doesn't. So we always start our weekly meetings with some sort of icebreaker, for lack of better terms, and they can be as goofy as something about what somebody did over the weekend, to what was their favorite food as a child, to if you could spin the globe and just point a place you want to be tomorrow, where would it be? Silly things like that help you really get a sense of who someone is and what their hopes and dreams are. And I just find that is a more window onto their soul without being nosy, right?
Mm-hmm. No, that's amazing. And I think it's important with any team that you get to know them both inside the corporation and outside. But I think you have to add to your list, don't talk about the weather and don't ask about the COVID story, because that's, I know, a joke with friends and fellow moms here that I have, where you get to a party and the first thing you talk about is, oh, you had COVID a month ago, or you've had it 3 times, or anything like that. And it's the same point. It's just an entry level way to get a conversation started, but you're not really digging into anything.
Exactly.
Well, that's great. So I believe, when I was going through some of your past articles and interviews, I saw you had a comment that a respected leader is described as someone who listened more than spoke. What do you think are some of the key aspects to being a good listener?
Well, in the book, I interviewed Dr. Julian Treasure, who has 4 or 5 TED Talks on how to be a better listener. So if anybody wants a takeaway, whether you read my book or not, go listen to one of Dr. Treasure's talks, because they are, extraordinarily informative. And one of the things I learned that I'm very bad at is something called reactionary listening, where I'm always thinking of like, what is she or he or they saying, so that I can then do, like, how can I be helpful? Because one of the underlying themes of my book and the way I live is, how can I be helpful? I'm not suggesting not taking the oxygen mask first, but I have seen over the course of my career, my life, when I'm helpful to others, the help comes back. Mm-hmm. So in his notion, though, when we are always thinking about the next thing or how we're going to respond, we're not paying attention. The other thing that I have learned is it's actually okay to carry a notepad or use your handheld device to take notes while the person is talking, because that way you actually can retain. I mean, it's hard enough to retain anything anyways, but if you jot a few notes down, you can really, have an imprint of what that person was saying. The third thing is he talked to me about, it's okay to let someone know that you missed what they said because you were daydreaming, or you were thinking about the Thai food you were going to have for lunch, or the dishes in your sink, or all the things that we think about sometimes when we should be paying attention. And sometimes if we are vulnerable enough and brave enough to be able to say, hey, Ken, I missed what you said. Do you mind repeating it? I missed it. And then take it down. That's actually a gift we give to one another, because it gives everyone a chance to kind of maybe reframe or restate. And it also helps you, again, be a better listener. But, just one little tip, when you go on walks, sometimes you'll go an entire walk and you won't even hear all the sound. Try going for a walk one day and actually listening to what, whether you live in the suburbs or the country or the city. One day I did that. I now make a habit of trying to do that to actually help my listening skills. It's amazing what you hear. I mean, yes, I'm in Brooklyn, so I hear sirens, but the birds that you normally wouldn't even hear because you're just, on your merry way, doing your email, talking on the phone. It's a magical thing, and it's a way to hone your listening and be better.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's interesting. Now I want to go do that.
Yeah, I promise you, your walks will never be the same.
Yeah. It's funny because I feel like most people, when they're going on a walk, they're going to put their earphones in and listen to a podcast or listen to music or go with someone else and talk the whole time. But yeah, thinking about going on a walk and just listening is really interesting. All right, we have an interesting comment here. It's not really a question, but I'm going to bring it up because it's relevant. Bruce, who is on the line, says, I make weather a great topic. Did you know there's something called the San Bruno fog break that makes the city of Millbrae, California, very sunny? He learned that the other day at a networking meeting. So that is great. There are ways to certainly start up a conversation about things like that. But yeah, I hear what you're saying, Susan, about you don't want to make it the topic of conversation.
Well, like I said, we are living in a time of tragic climate change. I mean, the planet is changing. It is going to be, when there's huge weather events, it's going to be part of the conversation. I just meant when you fall back on that every time, you won't gain anything. You won't learn anything about anyone else, and you won't share anything about you that perhaps might be a gift to others.
Mm-hmm. Very interesting. All right. So, again, going back to your book this time, rather than some of the interviews you've done, you talk a little bit about a SMART framework for offering support. Can you walk us through what that means and why it's important for us today?
Well, the book is divided into 3 sections, which I can walk you through at a 30,000 foot view. Gather, ask, do. And it's essentially a methodology for how to build connections and a way that you can use now, you can use later, you can use next month or next year. And I do dare I say, given kind of this transitionary time we're in now, where we're starting to come out of our hives, could be helpful. In the gather phase, which is the first phase, you do a bit of self-reflection to find out what your goals are the next 1 year, 3 year, 5 year. Okay. And then you think about who it is that you want to connect with or reconnect with that are going to help you meet those goals. You also think about what your superpowers are, because I think you heard me mention earlier about this underlying platform of leading with how you can be helpful to others. Well, it's difficult to be helpful to others if you don't realize what your superpowers are. And I often will get somebody who's just, fresh into their career or approaching retirement and say, well, what do I have to offer? And this is what is in the gather phase, where you do some real assessment, self-audit to find out what it is, because we all have superpowers and they're going to ebb and flow. And lastly, in the gather phase, you think about what you're going to do to break that hermetically sealed bubble that we all find ourselves in, where we tend to attract and stay close with people who look like us, sound like us, the same age, race, and color as us. So that's the gather phase. The ask phase, and this is why learning to be a better listener is important, is learning to ask the questions of others to find out what their hopes and dreams are, what their goals are. Because if you happen to do that and you listen carefully, you can go to the do phase, which is, as mentioned, my favorite place to be. And that's when you go into action. You make introductions, you offer up podcasts or newsletters that people might have interest in, or again, back to that introduction, or, if you have the means, you support, if they're part of a nonprofit that you find valuable, you write a small check. But this isn't a one and done. It's not like, well, I'll do this and that's it. This is over lifetime. So I encourage you to think about that methodology. And of course, I'd love your feedback. But I think oftentimes people say, well, how do you run around and always being so helpful? And again, this isn't just like I meet somebody at an event, I'm like, hi, how can I help? It's more learning to listen for what someone else's goals are, and then realizing how responsive and helpful we can be without giving up our jobs or our children, right? This is things you can be doing that are not massive lifts, but we have to just make the time for them. And that's when I go back to the 90% of our business. So I'm grateful I made the time to do these things over the years because I'm now reaping the benefits.
Mm-hmm.
So that's a lot of blah, blah. I'm sorry.
No, it's great. I mean, it's interesting. And I think you're right. When you're new in the business, and your first few years, you don't see the payoff. And sometimes you tend to give up or not continue to persevere. But you're right. I've seen it over my career that building the relationships and taking the time, even though sometimes it's hard, always pays off. And I will say too, the superpower exercise that you mentioned is really interesting. I've done that with a small group before. And as cheesy as it sounds, it is a very powerful exercise, especially when you're doing it as a group and you're hearing through others, where you excel and where you help kind of push the team. So that's great. I love that. So we do have a question that's relevant to what we were just talking about though. So you wrote about conversations, listen for 3 points, share 3 points. Why is that a good framework? Why 3?
Oh, well, it can be 10, it can be 4. Like my goal there is getting you out of this fear of walking into a room. Like it's a way to kind of set the stage. So instead of walking into a room, let's say of 50 people, whether it's online or in person, you're not like, oh my God, what do I do? So it's just a framework. And I've had some people say, I can only do 2. And I've had others say, you know what, I'm going to do 5. But as you notice, it's sharing 3 things, learning 3 things. So that means the weather talk doesn't really work there. Everybody's going to think I hate the weather.
But I like the emphasis though on the balance too, that it's about listening, but also sharing your presence and being present and sharing about you. So that's interesting. Very nice. So you've also, we've spoken a lot about relationships and communication in general, but let's go a little bit deeper. So you talk about authentic relationships and relationships that last, and you just alluded to that, and like them paying off over time throughout your career. I think that's a huge element of success, especially in business, especially in like sales or relationship driven businesses. But can you give us some tips on how you do that or how you coach your team to do that?
Well, I wish I had some, like enormous like technology device, like tips but I'm really old fashioned. I write things down. And maybe it's because I'm so old, but I have a notepad with me always, and I jot notes down. One thing I always do when I follow up with people, because I jotted things down, I will bring something in from the conversation we had, as opposed to just saying, oh, Ken, it was great meeting you at the MX conference. I'll have, I would share some point of conversation that we had there or something special that he mentioned, because if you think about it, and especially in a world filled with a lot of vitriol that we're living in right now, if we can remind somebody of their superpowers or remind them something special about themselves, that's one of the greatest gifts we can give one another, and they won't forget it. And I don't want to suggest that I'm being, what's the word I'm trying to think of, manipulative in any way. I mean, this is actually just being joyful and being kind. And not everyone will reciprocate, and that's okay too. And that probably took me a long time to realize, that a lot of people just aren't wired that way, and that's okay too. But that doesn't mean they don't enjoy, somebody saying, it was really great. I was thrilled to learn about the fact that you are a talented piano player. I mean, I'm just, I'm pulling it out. But I think also is when you do follow, like when you do meet people, as much as time constraints lead the way often, do what you can to do it soon, because we know what happens when you put things off. I've also, over the years, even before the pandemic, and again, this is me, and I'm an odd duck, but every morning I make the habit of texting or emailing or calling or WhatsApping or sending a smoke signal out to like 3 or 4 people every day. without a goal of necessarily a response, but more just like, hey, thinking of you. How are you? Or, hey, don't forget about me, especially during the pandemic. And again, with no preconceived, like I'm not looking for something in response. Occasionally it's nice when I do, but it's more just putting some joy out there. And I've done this for years, depending on the technology. I mean, I used to do it via fax at the end of the 80s, and then I realized I didn't know how to use the damn fax machine.
That's amazing. I think it's interesting. I had a boss on my very early years, and he used to, within his contact system in the computer, he would always have like wife's name, children's names, and age, and like all of these details to say when he did have another conversation with them, he could ask about the right things and talk about them and show them that he heard, and he is listening. So I think that's a great point. Very nice. So, we've spoken about relationships. Do you believe that career success and even to a degree, maybe personal happiness then are dependent on some of those relationships that are cultivated?
100%. I mean, I always, sometimes people are like, well, why do connections matter? I'm like, tell me, or think back to anything good that's ever happened in your life. Almost all of them happen because of connections and opening yourself up to connections. I'd love everyone on this call to think about that.
Well, let's talk about that. So you say opening yourself up. You also speak about vulnerability.
Yeah.
Why is that important, and how do you show that in some of the relationships you have?
Sure. I mean, you can't expect others to open if you're not going to open, right? I mean, and we're the beginning of the pandemic. I mean, I remember I was filled with dread because I have employees, and I was terrified that we were going to lose all our clients. And I thought about, I could come to our Monday meetings and be like, everything is going to be fine. And that would have been one tact. Or I could come to those Monday meetings and be human and let them know that, what, this is terrifying and it's okay to be terrified. And let's talk about this and let's handle it together. Mm-hmm. And everyone, I hate this term, but they did bring almost their full selves. And, we hear bring your full selves to work. Well, unless the leaders are going to make it comfortable, and certainly people of color or people who just don't feel they fit in are going to feel that they belong, unless you're helping people feel feel like they belong. So I think it's really important for leaders, managers to go the extra length, certainly in our professional lives. In our personal lives, in the mid 90s, when I started lugging home a ginormous laptop that was the size of my refrigerator, and at night I'd be doing my dishes in the sink in between uploading and downloading my email. I'd plug into the phone line, and then I'd have suds all over my hands because I'd been doing the dishes on my laptop. That was the end of work Susan and home Susan. Mm-hmm. And it doesn't mean that I never take a break, although I should take more breaks, but it's also, it's not that I take all my personal laundry and share it. It's more that I'm the same person. Mm-hmm. And it's hard enough being one person on this planet. Why in hell would we want to be two?
Yeah, it's interesting when you speak about leaders and that it comes from the top and that they have to open for others to open. I think that's really important and something that everybody on this call should certainly think about. I know in my company, we've spent a lot of time doing that and encouraging that and showing, even on how to give a presentation and where we're nervous and how we get around being nervous and what some of our tricks are to get rid of those nerves. And I think, more and more leaders and people aren't expected to have every answer, and it's okay. That's why there's a team. That's why there's a whole company working on things. So that's great advice. So a lot of what we've spoken about is really reflected in business and client partnerships and certainly personal areas. But where do you see gaps in team management and corporate culture today?
I think there is still this notion that this is for the annual sales conference or the monthly happy hour, instead of embedding team connections from people on different teams, and making that a priority and putting that at the top of and have it be part of their people's professional development. And that isn't because I wrote a book. I mean, I believed that a long time ago because, for years, one of the reasons I was successful in the corporations I worked at is because I took an active interest in the individuals outside of my role. That way I was a better employee because I understood what they were working on and vice versa.
Very nice. So, one of the things I've noticed throughout my career is that as, younger and younger generations come in, they're more and more hesitant to pick up the phone and call people and have a conversation. We can have 100 emails back and forth, or we can say, I don't know, they haven't answered my email in the last 3 weeks. And then you say, well, did you try calling? There. And there's just this huge fear over picking up the phone and being live, I think, and that concept that you can't hesitate or ask someone else a question. Do you think that that's gotten worse through the pandemic?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, but it doesn't have to be phone. You could set up a Zoom with somebody, right? And if texting is going to be more, again, I don't want to deem just because we've been doing it this way, it's the only way to do it, right? I will say, and all the studies show when we're in person versus this, you actually can make eye contact. You can see somebody's body language, and we lose all that. So whatever you can do to encourage employees when it's possible to be in physical contact with one another, not every day, but once a month, if you can, bring folks together, but encourage your employees to reach out in other modes, and they continue, if they're not getting an answer, try something else.
Very nice. So to that point, do you have any guidelines that you give your teams or that you live by on when to text versus call versus email people?
I ask
That's what their preference is.
Yeah.
Okay.
And I write it down, I put it in with and again, I can't do this for every single person, but the people that I'm, if you want a response, send it in the way people are going to answer. I mean, for the most part. And also don't make assumptions. We make assumptions, and I do it all the time. Oh, that person's young, so they must not. But, we could be surprised. Just ask.
Very nice. Well, this has been great. You're very insightful, very helpful, and so relevant to our world today. Is there anything else that you wanted to share that maybe we didn't touch on, or that is a highlight from some of your speaking engagements or your book?
Well, I would also say, for any of you that doubts the value of this, the actual science says that if you make building meaningful connections a core part of your life, with all things being equal, you will live longer. It is completely healthy, and it's good for your soul. So, if you needed any other reason other than the joy that comes from it, and the introductions to potential new careers, new likes, and all sorts of things, the health factor is really important, especially as we get older. So I would end on that note.
Very nice. And one more time, where can everyone buy your book?
Well, they can buy it anywhere that books are sold, but if Amazon is your go-to place, or Barnes and Noble, you can find it there. And you can find me on all the interwebs at Susan McPweb. I'm sorry, Susan McP1. I have Web 3 on my mind. Susan McP1. Or McPherson Strategies, of course.
Perfect. So one more time, her book is The Lost Art of Connecting, the Gather, Ask, Do method for building meaningful relationships. So thank you again, Susan. This has been amazing.
Thank you, Alicia. Thank you, Ken and Kathy. And really, really wonderful joining you.
It was great having you. All right. Thank you, everyone.